Putin thought he could control fear. Instead, he triggered the one thing that could destroy him, a nation that finally stopped being afraid. Putin never imagined it would unfold like this. Not in his Russia, not under his rule, not after decades spent tightening every bolt of the system until it groaned under the pressure. And yet here it is, an eruption he cannot smother, a wave he cannot outrun, because this time the spark came from his own hand. A mistake so catastrophic, so profoundly miscalculated that it ripped open a wound across the country he once claimed to control with absolute certainty. The streets tell the story before the Kremlin ever will. Across Moscow, St. Petersburg, Yekaterinburg, Kazan, cities that once moved with rigid, predictable order, something entirely different is happening tonight. Crowds surge like a living tide, faces lit not by propaganda screens, but by raw, unfiltered fury. Police lines buckle, sirens scream. The air vibrates with the sound of voices refusing to be silent any longer. This was not supposed to happen. Not after years of crushing dissent. Not after silencing critics, dismantling independent media, and building a surveillance machine powerful enough to map every whisper. Putin believed the fear he instilled would hold. He thought obedience was permanent. He thought Russians would swallow anything. But there is a limit, and tonight, Russia reached it. The trigger, of course, came wrapped in the usual cloak of cold, bureaucratic language. A brief announcement, dry and emotionless, delivered by a trembling state anchor who looked as if she understood the magnitude of the words she was forced to read. The order expanded mobilization. Mandatory. Indefinite. No exceptions. No hiding. No more pretending the war was distant, optional, or someone else's burden. For millions of Russians, the illusion shattered instantly. Phones exploded with messages. Border checkpoints overflowed within hours. Airline tickets vanished from the internet in seconds. Men who had never attended a protest in their lives found themselves shoved into crowds, chanting with strangers, united by one truth: if they don't resist now, they may never get another chance. Putin thought mobilization would cement control. Instead, it pried open every crack the Kremlin had been papering over for years. It exposed the economic strain the government refused to acknowledge. It forced families to confront the reality of a war they were assured would never touch them. It revealed the lies, the secrecy, the manipulation, things Russians tolerated quietly until the consequences arrived at their doorstep, demanding their sons. This wasn't just a political misstep, it was a rupture, a fatal one. And now the consequences roar through the streets. In Moscow, riot police move in tight formations, shields raised, batons out. But for every officer, there are 5, 10, 20 civilians pushing forward, grandmothers shouting at armored vans, teenagers live streaming the chaos, men refusing to step aside even with guns pointed at their chests. Something is different this time. It isn't just anger. It's clarity, a realization spreading like electricity. If the Kremlin can take this from them, if it can seize their future, their children, their safety, then there is nothing left to lose. Inside government buildings, panic spreads quietly. Officials who once parroted the same lines now whisper dissent behind closed doors. Some are already distancing themselves, giving cryptic statements, hinting that the decision was rushed, reckless, dangerous. They know what Putin refuses to admit: he overplayed his hand. The propaganda machine is running at full capacity, desperately trying to repaint the uprising as foreign influence, isolated unruliness, temporary instability. But the footage online tells another story, one the Kremlin cannot erase fast enough. Cities are swelling with crowds the state cannot contain. Men are burning draft notices in the streets. Mothers are blocking roads to stop buses full of recruits. Entire villages are forming human barricades to prevent the military from entering. Across the country, something long dormant is awakening. For years, the Kremlin believed terror was enough to keep Russia silent. But fear is a fragile weapon. Push too hard, take too much. And it reverses. It mutates into desperation, defiance, and eventually open rebellion. And tonight, that rebellion is no longer theoretical. It's visible. It's loud. It's spreading. Putin's fatal mistake wasn't simply mobilization. It wasn't even the war itself. His mistake was assuming that the Russian people were endlessly pliable, that he could push forever, demand forever, take forever. He forgot that even the tightest regimes cannot stop basic human instinct, the instinct to protect your family, your future, your freedom. Tonight, Russia is standing at a crossroads. One path leads to deeper repression, darker nights, harsher crackdowns. The other leads towards something far more unpredictable, a rising movement fueled not by politics, but by survival. And movements born out of survival do not fade quietly. They do not accept defeat easily. They do not disappear because a leader commands it. The Kremlin's grip has slipped, not completely yet, but enough that the world can see what Putin has spent 20 years trying to conceal. His power was never unshakable. It was only untested. Until now, the uprising spreading across Russia is more than protest. It is a reckoning, a consequence. A response to a leader who pushed his people past the point of tolerance and expected gratitude in return. And whether this storm grows or collapses under force, one truth is already undeniable. Putin cannot undo the moment he created. He cannot unmake the fear he ignited. He cannot silence the millions who now know, perhaps for the first time in decades, that his power is not absolute. Because once people realize their fear can be broken, it never fully returns. The Kremlin is bracing for impact. They won't say it publicly. Of course they won't. But inside those marble corridors, the panic is unmistakable. Not because this is the largest protest wave in years, but because it is the first one they did not expect. For 2 decades, Putin's regime has prided itself on predictability. Every election engineered, every news segment scripted, every protest smothered before it even began. The state believed it knew exactly how the Russian people would behave. Obedient, silent, afraid. But tonight, that calculation has been obliterated because the uprising isn't just in the major cities anymore. It's in the small towns, the forgotten places where loyalty to Moscow once ran deepest. Villages that had never seen a protest sign suddenly have roads blocked by angry parents who refuse to let military trucks pass. Regional governors are asking for clarity from the Kremlin, a word that in Russian politics is often code for "we think you just made a catastrophic mistake." Even state media hosts, those polished loyalists, are struggling to keep the narrative straight. Their smiles are tight, their voices crack, because they can feel it too. The story is slipping out of their hands. Meanwhile, across Russia, something extraordinary is happening. People who were once divided, politically, generationally, geographically, are finding themselves united by a single fear. If the Kremlin is willing to sacrifice this many people now, how many more will it demand tomorrow? This fear isn't abstract. It's personal. It's sitting at kitchen tables, in crowded apartments, on midnight phone calls between parents and children trying to plan an escape. It's in the eyes of women watching buses of young men drive away, not knowing if they will ever come back. And it's fueling a defiance that Putin's security apparatus was never designed to handle. See, the Kremlin knows how to silence political dissent. But this is not political. This is primal. This is survival. You cannot censor a mother trying to save her son. You cannot intimidate a father willing to stand in front of a draft officer's car. You cannot arrest an entire generation that has finally realized the future they were promised was a lie. And that realization is spreading faster than Putin's forces can respond. Inside the Ministry of Defense, officials are frantically trying to portray the mobilization as targeted, limited, organized. The reality is an administrative collapse. Draft notices sent to the wrong people. Men with no military training summoned overnight. Stories of disabled citizens, elderly men, even students being forced into recruitment centers. Russia isn't mobilizing, it's scrambling, desperate, chaotic. And chaos is deadly for an authoritarian regime. Already, whispers from within the Kremlin suggest that some senior officials warned Putin not to take this step. They knew the backlash would be enormous. They knew the public would not remain silent, but he ignored them. Because when leaders surround themselves with fear, they stop hearing the truth. And that silence leads to disaster. The uprising now sweeping across Russia is not the result of foreign influence, as the propaganda machine is desperately claiming. It is the result of one man's belief that power is infinite, that a nation can be pushed past its breaking point without breaking. That fear lasts forever. But fear is eroding rapidly, visibly. With every arrest, more people join the crowds. With every threat, their voices get louder. With every crackdown, the movement grows bolder. Putin's fatal mistake wasn't simply the mobilization order. It was believing the Russian people had no breaking point. Tonight proves they do. And he has found it. Across the country, people are no longer waiting for permission to resist. They are no longer waiting for a leader to speak on their behalf. They are acting on instinct, on the raw, unmistakable understanding that if they don't stand up now, they may never stand up again. This is not the end of Putin's rule. Not yet. But it is the first time in decades that his grip has visibly, undeniably slipped. A crack in the armor, a fracture in the foundation. And those fractures don't simply heal. They spread. The fractures are widening. Not quietly, not slowly, but with the force of a country waking up all at once. Across the regions, governors are calling emergency meetings. Some are openly contradicting Moscow's claims, blaming miscommunication, horrors, local misunderstandings. But those excuses aren't fooling anyone. They're not meant to. They're signals, subtle, cautious, but unmistakable. Signals that the Kremlin's authority is no longer absolute. That even loyal officials are beginning to protect themselves, distancing their futures from Putin's decisions. Because they can see what he refuses to acknowledge. The uprising is no longer a moment. It's a momentum, a shift in national consciousness. Even in Siberia, where fear once kept everyone silent, crowds are forcing police to retreat. In the North Caucasus, whole towns are chanting in unison, drowning out military officers trying to read recruitment lists. In the Far East, protesters are marching with the names of every man drafted from their neighborhood written on their banners. This is not a single protest wave. It is a nationwide refusal. And the Kremlin feels it. Inside Lubyanka, the headquarters of Russia's feared security services, lights burn long past midnight. Reports flood in. Protests here, blockades there. Resistance everywhere. Agents frantically comb through social media, searching for organizers, leaders, instigators. But that's the problem. There are none. Not in the traditional sense. This movement isn't being directed. It's erupting everywhere at once, without coordination, without central leadership, without a figure the state can arrest to make it all go away. This is the nightmare scenario for authoritarian regimes, an uprising born not from ideology, but from lived reality, from parents refusing to sacrifice their children for a government that has given them nothing but grief. The most dangerous movements in history are not planned, they are spontaneous. And this one is spreading faster than the Kremlin can suppress. Videos of draft officers being chased out of towns ignite courage in neighboring regions. Images of mothers forming human chains inspire others to do the same. Every act of resistance becomes fuel for the next, a self-sustaining fire. Meanwhile, Putin is isolated, surrounded by advisors terrified to give him bad news. He still believes he controls the narrative, that he can replace reality with a televised version of events, that the people will eventually fall back in line. But they won't, because the veil is gone. For years, Russians were told the war was distant, controlled, manageable, that it demanded nothing from them, changed nothing for them, threatened nothing in their daily lives. That illusion evaporated the moment mobilization arrived at their doors like a midnight knock. Now, the truth is undeniable. This war is not special, not temporary, not far away. It is here. It is now. It is taking their brothers, husbands, fathers, sons. And Putin cannot spin that away. Not with censorship, not with arrests, not with lies, not even with violence, because fear works only when people believe it will save them, when it feels safer to obey than to resist. Tonight, for millions of Russians, that balance has shifted. Obedience is now the greater threat. Silence is now the greater danger, and the regime's weapons, detention, intimidation, force no longer guarantee control. If anything, they accelerate the anger, and that anger is the one thing Putin cannot control, cannot predict, cannot defeat. The uprising unfolding right now is not simply a reaction to mobilization. It is the breaking point of accumulated frustration, the collapse of years of pressure, propaganda, and pretense. A country that has been told for decades to keep its head down is finally lifting it. And what happens next may be unlike anything Russia has seen in a generation. The ground beneath the Kremlin is shifting, and for the first time in years, the shift is visible, even to those closest to Putin. Intelligence briefings, once filled with carefully curated optimism, now contain warnings. Warnings about rising unrest. Warnings about defiance spreading through military units. Warnings about families refusing to hand over their sons. Warnings the Kremlin hoped never to see. Some of these warnings are being softened, diluted before reaching Putin's desk, not because the truth is unclear, but because officials are terrified of how he'll react. This is the silent danger of authoritarian rule. When fear replaces honesty, leaders go blind, and blind leaders make fatal decisions. Putin's circle is shrinking. The distance between him and reality is widening. And outside that bubble, reality is turning volatile. Draft centers are being set on fire across the country. Not one, not two, but dozens. A level of coordinated rage that Russian authorities have not faced in decades. In some regions, military officers refuse to enter certain towns without backup. In others, they're retreating entirely, overwhelmed by crowds too large and furious to control. The Ministry of Internal Affairs is demanding reinforcements. The National Guard is stretched thin, forced to choose between cracking down in one region or losing control in another. Every decision feels like a temporary patch on a dam that's already splitting apart. And the Kremlin knows if the dam breaks, the flood will be unstoppable. But the most alarming sign for Putin isn't the protests or the fires or the packed border crossings. It's the conversations happening quietly in Russian households. Families who once avoided politics entirely are now discussing escape routes. Soldiers' wives are forming secret networks to warn each other about upcoming raids. University students are organizing underground groups to protect classmates from recruitment officers. Even older generations, once the backbone of Putin's support, are expressing doubts out loud. This is unprecedented because political opinions in Russia rarely change overnight. But survival instincts do. And when survival is threatened, silence evaporates. The Kremlin's response has become increasingly frantic. New laws, harsher penalties, vague threats, emergency decrees, all designed to reestablish fear. But fear is no longer functioning the way it used to. People hear these threats and push harder. They see the crackdowns and stand closer together. They watch the regime panic, and it only confirms what they already suspected: Putin is losing control. Slowly, maybe quietly. Not anymore. Reversibly, that's becoming less certain by the hour. Because the regime's greatest vulnerability is now exposed. It cannot fight both a foreign wars and a domestic uprising at the same time. And the Russian people have realized something crucial. The more resources Putin spends trying to suppress them, the fewer he has to enforce mobilization. The more resistance spreads, the harder it becomes to fill the ranks. The more chaos erupts at home, the more the illusion of stability collapses. That illusion, the myth of unshakable Kremlin power, is crumbling in real time. And with every chant, every clash, every act of defiance, the people are rewriting the boundaries of what is possible. Because uprisings don't begin with the fall of a regime. They begin with the fall of certainty. And tonight, across Russia, one certainty has already shattered: that Putin's power is forever. And once the belief in forever collapses, everything else becomes possible. That's the danger Putin faces now. Not a single protest, not a single region erupting, but a psychological shift spreading faster than any police crackdown can contain. People are not just angry. They are awakening. They are realizing that the regime's power depends not on strength, but on submission. And when submission ends, so does the illusion of control. Across Russia, the signs of that awakening are multiplying. In Dagestan, entire communities are blocking highways, surrounding police cars, shouting down officers who once ruled those areas with unquestioned authority. In Buryatia, women storm recruitment offices, demanding lists of the men taken from their villages. In Yakutsk, protesters chant ancient indigenous songs, turning cultural identity into a form of resistance the Kremlin cannot dilute or suppress. These are not isolated incidents. They are the beginnings of a pattern Putin cannot predict because it is driven by something he cannot command: collective refusal. And that refusal is being broadcast across the world in real time. For years, the Kremlin controlled the narrative by controlling the cameras. But smartphones have broken that monopoly. Every beating, every confrontation, every act of courage is being captured in seconds, uploaded, shared, amplified. Footage the authorities delete in one region reappears in three others, fueling more resistance. The Kremlin's propaganda machine is overheating. Its lies are unraveling. Its censors can't keep up. And the more information spreads, the more Russians begin asking questions they never dared voice. Why is this war worth our lives? Why should our sons be sacrificed? Why should one man's ambition decide our future? Questions that, once asked, never fully disappear. Inside the military itself, murmurs of dissent are growing. Some officers refuse to enforce chaotic orders. Others quietly warn families when new mobilization lists are coming. There are reports, small now, but increasing, of recruits refusing to board buses, of commanders overwhelmed by resistance within their own units. When a regime begins losing the obedience of its own enforcers, that is when the real danger begins. And Putin knows this. He senses it. You can see it in his recent speeches, the tightening jaw, the clipped tone, the frustration masked as resolve. He blames the West. He blames saboteurs. He blames traitors. But deep down, he knows the truth. He cannot say aloud, this crisis is not foreign made. It is homegrown. It is the direct result of his own decisions, his secrecy, his ambition, his arrogance, his fatal mistake. And now he is trapped in the consequence. The regime is scrambling for options. More police. They're already overstretched. More censorship. The internet routes around it. More propaganda. The public is no longer swallowing the script. More force. It may only accelerate the revolt. Because here is the truth about uprisings. They do not begin when people feel powerful. They begin when people have nothing left to lose. And Putin has taken so much, their security, their stability, their future, their sons, that for millions, the cost of obedience has finally outweighed the cost of resistance. That is the tipping point every autocrat fears. And tonight, Russia is balancing on it. No one knows what comes next. Not the protesters in the streets, not the generals in their offices, not even the Kremlin's inner circle. But one thing is certain, the Russia of 3 days ago is gone, replaced by a nation trembling, awakening, refusing. And once a population realizes its fear has limits, a leader's power does too. And so we arrive at the moment the Kremlin never wanted, the moment Putin spent 2 decades trying to prevent, the moment when the fear that built his empire begins to crumble beneath him. For years, he believed control was permanent. That a nation could be shaped by force, held by silence, ruled by intimidation. That if he tightened the system enough, welded every crack shut, the people would never find a way out. But power built on fear is always temporary. It lasts only as long as people believe in the threat behind it. And now that belief is breaking. Not because the regime has weakened, but because the people have changed. The uprising sweeping across Russia isn't just a reaction to mobilization. It's a declaration that the old rules no longer apply, that the Kremlin's script no longer dictates how this story ends. Families who once whispered are now shouting. Communities once divided are now united. Regions long ignored are now leading the charge. And a population that once kept its head down is now standing tall. Putin may still command the institutions, the police, the courts, the military, but institutions cannot stop a movement born out of survival. They cannot contain a nation that has realized its own power. This is not the end of Putin. History doesn't move in straight lines. But it is the end of something far more important, the era in which Russians believed they were powerless. From this moment on, every decision he makes, every order he gives, every attempt to tighten the screws will be met with a population that now knows the truth, that even the most powerful regime can crack, that even the strongest leader can falter, that even the deepest fear can be broken. And once broken, fear does not return to its former shape. Tonight, the streets of Russia are filled not with certainty, but with possibility, the possibility of change, of defiance, of a future not written by the Kremlin, but by the people themselves. Putin's fatal mistake was not mobilization. It was forgetting one simple truth: a nation is not held together by force, but by consent. And when that consent disappears, when millions rise, refuse, resist, no amount of power can restore what has been lost. This uprising may not decide Russia's future outright, but it has already changed its course. Because the people have crossed a threshold from which there is no going back. And history will remember this moment, not for the order that sparked it, but for the courage that followed. A courage the Kremlin cannot extinguish. A courage that will shape what comes next. This is how the beginning of the end looks. Not with a collapse, but with a crack that widens, grows, spreads until the weight of truth becomes too heavy for any regime to bear. And no matter how long it takes, no matter how brutal the response, the message echoing through Russia tonight is unmistakable. The people have awakened, and they will not sleep again.